Welcome to this week's episode of Building This Community. Our guest today is Michael Lindenberger. He is currently the Deputy Opinion Editor at the Houston Chronicle. His education includes a bachelor's in political science from the University of Louisville. He has his JD from the Louis Brandeis School of Law at the University of Louisville. And he even has a postgraduate fellowship in journalism at Stanford University. With all that background and with that said, Michael, thanks for joining us today.
A great idea, this podcast. I'm excited about talking about Louisville and policy and journalism. So let's get started.
Well, we're glad to have you on here. Is there any way you can tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background?
Sure. I'm from Louisville. In fact, my dad's family's been here since it was founded. My dad, John Lindenberger, is a descendant of James Patton, who's one of the founders of the city, down with George Rogers Clark to settle at the Falls of the Ohio in 1778. So I grew up here, went to Trinity High School, then University of Louisville, and have been involved in journalism ever since my teenage years, really. Went to the University of Louisville, was editor of the paper there, but also was editor of a weekly paper in Portland, Tennessee when I was very young, and came back to Louisville to be managing editor eventually at the evening news across the river in Jeffersonville. And, about 20 years ago, I left town to go work for the Dallas Morning News and other newspapers, and came back to Kentucky for about a 5-year stint and worked for the Courier-Journal as a state correspondent, and went to law school at night, a law school you're familiar with, of course. So, and then when I graduated from there in 2006, I signed on with Time Magazine as a legal affairs writer, and eventually went back to the Dallas Morning News, where I was there for about another 12 years. Until moving to the Houston Chronicle. And I worked for the Morning News in Dallas, and was in Austin often writing about policy and politics there, and also was a Washington correspondent for business and government in of course, Washington. So I had a pretty wide-ranging career for them before I went to Houston, where I'm sort of the day-to-day leader of the editorial board, work as the deputy opinion editor there. So.
Well, Michael, that's really impressive background. That's really impressive stuff. We know most of your reporting focuses on politics at the national level with some op-ed work thrown in there. But can you maybe talk about the role you think that press plays in local politics and policy development at the city level?
Well, sure. In most of my career, I was a local journalist, so I can talk about that with a lot of familiarity. I mean, there's really no substitute for a vigorous press in a local discussion about the future of, say, a city. It's because there's very few other entities that are going to spend the money or have the money to send somebody to sit through city council meetings or transportation board meetings or transit agency meetings to try to understand the people and perspectives that form the policy that affect the lives of people that live there. So all of those political processes are influenced by the media, but to some degree or another, even if it's just, needing to get the word out, say helping the agencies get the word out, that's an important role. But that independent factor, or somebody who's not afraid to push back and say, this doesn't make sense, this isn't honest, this is, this happened last year and now you're saying this, well, that's not true. I mean, the role of the media is just to hold up a mirror to both the officials and also to the public, so they know what's going on. It's a difficult job because it takes a lot of time and attention and resources to do it well.
Well, absolutely. And speaking about attention to detail, with you having a law degree, do you think that background in the law provides you a benefit when you're working on, analyzing a policy or analyzing stories? And do you think that more lawyers should get involved in that type of work?
Well, when I got done with law school, I wasn't sure if I was going to stay in journalism. I thought I was. That was my plan. But what I did come out of law school with was a sense that no matter what it was that somebody put in front of me, if it was written in English, I was going to be able to understand it. I may have to read it several times, but I was going to be able to understand it. And so when I decided to go back into journalism full time, and I was writing about legal issues for Time Magazine, so that was obviously a benefit in that regard. But going back to be a full-time newspaper reporter, I wanted a job that would reward attention to complex details. And so, I had an offer in Houston at the time to go write about the business of medicine. Well, Houston has the world's largest hospital complex, and this was in 2007 when, everybody knew that there was the healthcare policy was going to be dominant in the coming years. So that appealed to me a great deal. But I ended up going back to Dallas to write about transportation because it seemed like the perfect marriage of politics and policy. Governor Rick Perry had decided that the way to keep up with the enormous growth of Texas's big cities, and it's unbelievable how much growth Houston, Austin, Dallas, Fort Worth have had over the last 20 years. But in order to keep up with that enormous population growth and economic growth, they needed to invest heavily, in Dallas alone, billions of dollars in infrastructure. But Governor Perry was committed, as most Republicans at the time were, to not raise taxes. And so how do you do, your obligation to keep business, especially if you're a pro-business Republican like he was, how do you keep business moving without raising taxes? It was a very difficult problem. So what they did instead was tell everybody, I'm not going to raise taxes, but then raised a host of fees, which in the transportation world were obviously tolls. But what their innovation was to look at tolling as not a mechanism to pay for the roads, but rather as a revenue source that would be permanent. So they began to price the demand. And it wasn't obviously originated with the Texas politicians, but they put it into practice at a much greater scale than anywhere else had. And they looked at a busy corridor and said, all of that traffic represents a demand. There's more people that want to use that road than the lanes will accommodate. So if we start pricing access to those roads, there's enormous money in that. And that's what they did. And so they would borrow against that in the future. They would go to the bondholders and say, we can guarantee you that because this demand is there, we'll get so much revenue each year for the next 40 years to pay these bonds off. And they would leverage all that up front, billions and billions of dollars. And some of it would be used to build new highways, and others would be used to build other infrastructure that had nothing to do with those tolls. And, that's actually, I'm talking about that here in Louisville, but Louisville adopted that same strategy when it built the toll bridges. It's like we're not using the tolls to pay for the bridge. I was just going to say that Louisville or Kentucky and Indiana really borrowed that same approach, leveraged, borrow a bunch of money against future traffic, and then use that money to either, in the case of Louisville, build these two bridges, or in the case of Texas, where they told about $10 billion worth, they used it for all kinds of purposes there. So.
You're talking about using your legal expertise and experience and training to delve more into these policies, which is absolutely necessary. But as you see newspapers either sell out to national chains or simply close, how is it that they are to afford or bring in people to provide that level of expertise or even knowledge that you can provide?
Yeah, I think, and I appreciate you kind of reining me back in. I guess to answer the question, the law degree helped me cover very complex financial dealings with very high lawyers on the other side of the table. And one of the things in journalism is you'll find out pretty quickly that obviously government agencies usually want you to have less information than you want to have. And they use, lawyers and everybody else to try to intimidate you, to try to tell you that you're only entitled to this, or let me explain this to you. You don't need to read it yourself. And so having a law degree just gives you more confidence to be able to say, actually, I already understand this, so answer my questions, and it made a big difference. It earned a lot of respect from, $1,000 an hour lawyers who were used to not having to deal with journalists in that way.
Given the fact that hiring both lawyers and various other experts is extremely expensive, and given your experience across the spectrum from, national outlets to local journalism, what is kind of your view on where local journalism is going, both from a coverage perspective and also just financially?
Newspapers, before the crisis, it wasn't unusual for quality newspapers to hire people with large, with heavy expertise. I mean, and when I went to the Dallas Morning News initially 20 years ago, we had PhD writers that wrote about, PhD holders who wrote about science. They still do, actually. We had, art critics that were part-time professors of art criticism. We had investigative journalists who were either lawyers or, with years of experience of that kind of work. So it wasn't unusual to have, amongst your reporting staff, a whole, plethora of extraordinarily educated or experienced reporters. Now, those are more expensive. I mean, over time, but at the time, 20 years ago, that was just, if you were going to be in the game of a major metropolitan newspaper, you were going to spend the money necessary to hire journalists who had that kind of expertise. And you see that at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, et cetera, even in the Courier Journal. And there's more way, Howard Feynman, for instance, was a reporter who got his degree from U of L Law, worked for the Courier Journal, went on to Newsweek and all of his later fame. But it wasn't that unusual to have particularly law graduates, but other, master's degrees and other kinds of expertise on a news staff. One of my colleagues at the Morning News who left just a couple years ago who wrote about public health, was an epidemiologist. So, there really was a lot of emphasis on hiring people that knew what they were talking about.
So do you think that's something that newspapers can maintain? Again, you're seeing these newspapers either be bought out or close their doors entirely. How do you see those newspapers moving forward? Are they going to have to hire cheaper labor, or what's kind of your prediction? What are you saying?
It's hard to say for sure. If you look at a place like the Courier Journal, they still have fantastically experienced and talented journalists, but they also have folks that come in at a whole lot earlier in their career than maybe they would have 15 years ago, which means they're cheaper. So, there's been pressure on dwindling newsrooms to save money. Even in for instance, at the Dallas Morning News, there were lots of people that were hired much earlier in their career at more senior positions than maybe they would have been 15 years ago. But there's still a tremendous amount of talent in these newsrooms. So, going forward, I think, when I talk to young journalists, I think it's a huge advantage to develop some type of expertise, whether it's a master's degree in science or, physics or a law degree or what have you. And I think a lot of people still do that.
Well, and ultimately that helps you as a journalist police the policy-making decisions of whatever field that it's in, right?
Absolutely. A good journalist learns to do that, whatever. A huge number of journalists who are fantastic have bachelor's degrees and they're more generalists, but they learn their expertise on the job. And that's certainly, there's tons of people that are examples of that.
What do you think would help local publications kind of survive more or start to thrive again?
Oh man, that's $1 million question. I think for a long time, newspapers kind of gave their content away, even in print. The only thing they charged was basically to recover their printing costs and delivery costs, and the rest they depended on advertising. Well, advertising has plummeted year after year, and so the newspapers who have found some type of stability have raised their prices quite a bit, so that circulation revenue, subscription revenue, is now either equal to, or in some cases say 60-40 to advertising revenue. But a lot of places have done that. Dallas Morning News was one of the first. The Boston Globe was very aggressive about it. But if you do that without investing in the product, you end up asking people to pay more and more for a diminishing product. And I think that's a losing strategy. But I do think the answer is charging for your content, but also having somehow the resources to invest in the content so that it sounds like a good deal to people.
Do you think that newspapers need to go to the nonprofit route in order to offset more costs?
I don't think going to nonprofit saves you any money at all. The only difference, the profit that you get would be, the revenue that comes in excess of your expenses. If you're a regular company, it becomes profit and it goes off to the owner somewhere at their discretion. If you're a nonprofit, that excess money stays there, presumably, which would be a good thing, except it doesn't. But if you're having trouble making that profit, it's not going to help you all of a sudden to become nonprofit. Mm-hmm. You still have to produce more revenue than you expend.
Michael, going from the business of reporting to actually the subject matter of some reporting, I know Houston, being based there, is famous among attorneys for its zoning laws. Can you tell us a little bit about Houston zoning and why it's held out as so unique?
Well, first of all, I've spent a lot of years writing about urban policy in Dallas, and on the editorial board we do talk about these, but I'm not as expert about the history of Houston zoning as maybe I would have been about Dallas. But I can tell you this: the bottom line is that Houston doesn't have traditional zoning laws like most other cities, and so whereas in Louisville, you might have a whole area zoned, or every property will be zoned for either commercial or residential or some other use. And so it ends up meaning that in most places of the city, you get, all residents, and then maybe on the outskirts of that neighborhood, you have a 4-lane road where retail businesses are permitted, and then maybe you have an office park with office permit. So it's all segregated, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And there's, it was all about good planning and smart intentions that brought that about. Houston has just a different view. It's, I want to say you can just build wherever you want, but that's not true either, because there's restrictions. Many homeowners associations have all kinds of restrictions on uses. So it's not as free for all as maybe its image is. But you do find, you drive around Houston, you'll find, a certain kind of business here, and then right next to it another kind of business, and then down, 2 blocks over, 3 or 4 blocks of houses, and maybe, so there's a little more helter-skelter with the development.
Now, one thing I've noticed, I think it was kind of a prominent issue in the Democratic primaries in Kentucky. The national reporting and the local reporting might not have matched up as much, but when I'm thinking about Houston, there were a lot of national stories, a lot of headlines made during Hurricane Harvey that they pinned a lot of the blame on the damage in Houston on those lack of zoning laws. Now, being a little bit closer to the issue, do you think that was a fair analysis, or were those headlines maybe out of touch with what locals felt?
Give me the argument that links the zoning to the damage. What was their main?
To the best of my recollection, the major publications that I read that covered the story tried to argue that basically Houston's lack of zoning led to this breakneck pace of growth. And when the city was growing that fast, replacing grasslands and areas that would have capably handled the runoff and like the water drainage issues. They were replaced with concrete at a pace that the city of Houston really didn't account for. And so you had this problem, this drainage problem that was really result, they argued, of the lack of zoning.
Yeah, a narrative that was spread across the media.
Yeah.
I didn't in Houston until right after Harvey. Mm-hmm. So I hesitate a little bit to call a referee on that. But I can say that, there were lots of problems with inadequate preparation, but I don't know that it really comes down to zoning. I mean, a lot of it has to do with, like anywhere else, some neighborhoods get neglected, other neighborhoods get more attention. And I think, people who live in neighborhoods that don't have as much attention, sometimes are left without as close a preparation as they should have had. But I also say, there are lots of really well-off neighborhoods that got hammered in Harvey, and it wasn't about zoning. For instance, when they opened the safety valves and just flooded some neighborhoods out in, say, Katy, that didn't have anything to do with zoning. That was just the houses.
That was a decision. Yeah.
So what do you think then that zoning generally plays a role with business development, or even some of the segregation or racial divide in the city of Houston, like having a lack of zone? Because Louisville is a very zoned city, and we have a lot of I would almost say segregation in housing.
I think every city, here's the thing, in every city in America that I'm aware of, there's tremendous income segregation, and that has accelerated enormously in the last 20 years, 30 years. And that's happened in Houston and Dallas as well as Louisville. And because, especially like in Louisville, if you look at the demographics, there's quite a bit of diversity in the city of Louisville. But if you move up, if you stratify that by income band, and the further up that band you go, the diversity falls off. And so, in Louisville, if you're talking about who lives within, say, 150% of the poverty level, the minority representation in that group is a whole lot higher than it is for the city as a whole. And so because people live in income segregated neighborhoods, that means that you have racially segregated neighborhoods. And, you could kind of talk about chicken and egg, like how that came about, but that's accelerated. In Dallas, for instance, I did a year-long project on the working poor with some colleagues, and we found that, I don't have the exact stats in front of me, but over the last 30 years, it was now twice as likely or more that you lived in an all rich or all poor neighborhood. And there's all kinds of social science research that shows that if you're poor and live in a neighborhood where everybody's poor versus the same situation if you're poor living in a neighborhood that's mixed income, you're going to end up having a whole lot more opportunities, or the results, at least, of upward mobility are a lot more pronounced for that person living in the mixed neighborhood. So, even to the point where there was a study at Stanford and Harvard that showed that they went back and looked at all the patent holders for decades and then traced every single one of them back to their neighborhoods at their birth, basically, or the first 10 years of their life, and tried to figure out how economically diverse those census tracts were. And the folks that, the people that lived, even when you stripped away all the variances in income, the people that lived at whatever income level in a neighborhood where it was mixed had more patents, whether they were poor, rich, medium, when they were young. So those things all have impacts on people. And I think income segregation is a huge thing.
You're sounding inverse to the conventional wisdom that, a lack of zoning would allow for businesses to develop anywhere, and therefore, hasn't that been the calling card for so long that, because Houston can have businesses develop anywhere, then that should help alleviate maybe some of the income segregation that you're talking about?
Well, first of all, in cities like Houston and Dallas, they're much more diverse up the income ladder than, say, in Louisville. Now, it's not night and day. It's not 3 times as more diverse, but you do, in a city like Dallas and a city like Houston, where there are so many jobs that recruit and bring people from out of state, there's a lot more diversity in, say, the middle class or I don't know what income bracket you want to talk about, but say, somebody who's between 30 and 40 making $80,000. That's going to be a lot more diverse, that cohort, in those cities than in a place like Louisville, in part because those Dallas and Houston are growing so fast. They're bringing in so many people, and a lot of the recruitment is done by companies who have placed a value on diversity, and so that's different to begin with. But to answer your question about zoning, the biggest impact of no zoning is that it makes property cheaper. And so it's, when you place rules on development of property, those are restrictions, and those all get priced in. Now, you might get all kinds of benefits from that. For instance, maybe you'd have better flood preparation. I'm not for sure about that, but let's just say you would. Or you'd have, more better neighborhoods that people value more highly for the housing. Or you could just talk about, you might have benefits, but it costs more. And so that's a restraint on trade. And in Houston, there's that regulatory burden is gone, or at least much reduced. And so it does make it a little cheaper in total to develop business. But again, it's like any other regulatory burden. Really strict environmental rules also place burdens, but they probably keep you from dying from bad air as easily. So it's not all the inputs get priced evenly.
Going more broad, then, do you have any general policies that you've seen maybe unique to Houston or Dallas, I guess, aside from zoning, or even Texas for that matter, that you think you see as good building blocks for city development, that maybe it's something that Louisville could incorporate?
I thought about that, and I don't know that I have I wish I did. I don't know that I have a great recommendation to say, do this more like they do in Dallas or Texas. The biggest difference in Dallas and Houston and Louisville is the recruitment of a diverse middle class. And when I went to the Derby Eve party, I was a guest of the mayor's in 2012 or something. And I looked around, and there were like 400 people that were brought in to celebrate the city and also to sort of recruit economic development. And I was there about 2.5 hours. I saw, I think, 3 African-American people in the whole group, and 2 of them one of them was the mayor of another city. I can't remember which city, Baton Rouge maybe, but I'm not sure about that. And then 2 of them were working the event. And I thought,
wow.
Oh, man.
All of the bad optics that can come out of Texas, that would just be impossible in Dallas or Houston. And now I have been back to that party, and it wasn't so stark in even the very next year, but still it was an exception. And so, it's not like a magic wand that you could change that. But I think Louisville totally underestimates just how big of a liability its lack of diversity up and down the income ladder really is. And I think that affects, maybe it's a chicken and egg thing too, but it affects its recruitment for corporate, headquarters and other relocations. And without those, maybe they don't have that accelerant that Dallas and Houston have.
Well, and part of it too, right, is that wealth begets wealth. So being a major or mega city like Houston or Dallas, they can pull from Louisville or other mid-sized cities that Louisville can't quite pull the opposite direction. So,
but the bottom line is in say Dallas, there's 1,000 people a day coming to the Metroplex just every day. on average. Now that was true a few years ago. It may not be true today. And so, they brought all kinds of problems too. They brought cars, they needed roads, they needed housing. But they were coming. And all the years I lived in Dallas, I never saw the downtown or midtown, kind of near downtown area, without many cranes. It was just constantly growing. And growth brings challenges and headaches. But Louisville, I think a lot of people who live here relish the fact that it kind of grows very slowly, but it doesn't change maybe as much as other places. And I can see some benefit to that. But I think it's Achilles' heel is this lack of diversity. And of course, it's showing in different ways currently in the political arena, but in the social arena. But I think just economically and in urban planning, that's a big factor over time.
Well, Michael, we're starting to wind it down here. We just got a couple more questions for you. I want to give you an opportunity to kind of plug. Are there any projects you're currently working on, or anything personal or in your career that you want to let people know about right now?
Well, let's see. We're doing great work, I think, in the midst of the pandemic at the Houston Chronicle. I've never been reminded more forcefully of the relevance of local journalism in a time of crisis like this. And I'm so proud to see, really not just our paper, but even my old paper, Dallas Morning News. It's just amazing to me how much usefulness the papers have provided for people, and it's being rewarded by very large increases in circulation, which has partially offset the even larger plummet in advertising during the pandemic. So I just put a plug in for local journalism, period. We work on the opinion side. People, very much are interested in what we say, whether they hate us or love us. It's a good conversation that they, I think, trust to have, after so many decades of it being there. But then beyond that, I don't know. I'm working on trying to put together a book about the vanishing landscape of gay America, which I've been researching since 2015 after an assignment for the cover story of the New Republic about the sort of hidden history of gay rights long before the gay marriage fight, which I covered for Time. And, I have a blog on the side that people in Kentucky might like called bourbonstory.com. It's about the business of bourbon straight up. So I don't post as much as I used to. We launched pretty ambitiously in 2014 with the editors in Texas and Washington and Louisville, and out west we had a West editor, and then California, I think. So anyway, it was Chicago. I'll take that back. But anyway, so I still write about bourbon on that. I enjoy that. So let's keep them busy.
Well, that's awesome, and I agree. I don't think you can overstate the importance of reporting during this pandemic, and we appreciate all the work that you and your paper are doing on that. I'm honest, I'm going to have to check out that bourbon blog myself. That's too funny. Yeah, and our final question before we let you go, we like to ask all our guests, if you had the power to change one policy here in Louisville, what would it be?
Well, leaving aside all the concern about police and race right now, which is taking deserved first attention, I would love to see something like, I would love to see the mayor of Louisville, the city of Louisville, put some skin in the game for the creative community in Louisville. So my idea, Greg Fisher, if you're listening, is to find some corporate sponsors and maybe find some pennies hidden in the couches of the city budget to come up with say $100,000 a year, and have invite folks to town to be writers in residence, maybe find a group of apartments. I know they're like the Weisinger Galbert building downtown at 4th Street or 3rd Street. I guess it's whatever it is down there. They have a bunch of tiny apartments that Actors Theater uses for their interns and stuff. Find a place to house creative types, writers, artists, photographers, poets, etc., and bring them to Louisville. They could each be workshop leaders, take on a group of 5 or 10 mentees, pay them a salary for 6 months or a year and have them do work, create things in Louisville. I don't know if it bothers you, but think of all the other big cities in America, mid-sized cities, that have been featured prominently in novels and other famous pieces of literature. And we don't have that. We've got a cameo in The Great Gatsby, I guess, is our best, and maybe Bill Murray and Stripes, a couple footage of Fort Knox, maybe. But I would just say the city could put forward. All throughout human history, government has been a patron of the arts. So let's bring back some artists to our city and raise up our own artists. That's what I'd say.
I think that is a super interesting idea. That final question always yields like such a wide array of answers. I think that is really interesting. I like that a lot.
If this podcast makes it big, maybe everybody can contribute.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, either way, Michael, I really appreciate you coming on. I think we're gonna let you go and then dive into a follow up, our thoughts on the interview. But we really appreciate you stopping by to talk to us.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Well, look, that was another exciting episode that we had this week. I always enjoy talking to Michael Lindenberger. He's, I've known him for a very long time. We try and get, drinks whenever he's in town. And he's kind of like our previous guest, Albie, in that he is so fascinating. He knows so much about so many different topics, or at least he presents it that way. And every time you talk to him, you can get a unique perspective on a myriad of new topics. So
no, I thought it was a great interview. I love talking to journalists anytime I get the chance, especially somebody that works for like such a reputable paper. I mean, and
worked for Time at one point too.
Yeah. The funny thing, in getting ready for this episode, I actually Googled some of like his previous like writings, and it turns out I'd actually read at least 2 articles from him in the past, and I hadn't even noted that it was the same guy. Yeah.
Wow. Well, so the one thing that I think was just off the bat that I thought was interesting was his idea at the very end there about developing an art culture in Louisville. And this is, again, why this podcast is so important. We haven't done it as much this season as maybe we will in future seasons, but getting people from that national and international perspective to say, this is what other cities are doing, art scenes, for example, and figuring out a way to apply it or grow it in Louisville. And so his concept of let's use some Metro funds to provide housing and maybe some sort of like grant programs to help bring artists in to, whether it's in theater or writing or just traditional like painting or whatever the musicians. I think that's a phenomenal idea.
Yeah. It was super interesting, really unique compared to like everybody else we've talked to. I think it's a super interesting idea. I know we've got a lot of local artists in Louisville, and then they're doing great work. It's not to say that they're not, but if we could do something as a city to try and incentivize that or even grow that community, I mean, that would be tremendous, I think, for the city in general.
And I think if money were no issue, I think there's a chance that would happen tomorrow. But it is worth, I think, delving into to see what the net return would be for a city like that. And again, it goes back to what he mentioned, what's our last greatest known art piece that relates to Louisville? Is it really just the shout out in Great Gatsby? I mean, that's part of it, right? So I know there was supposed to be that TV show about a cat cafe with one of the people from Big Bang Theory at one point, but I don't know that really ever took off. So we don't have necessarily the notoriety in the art scene, other than maybe like the Louisville Orchestra, which has had a historic amount of press.
Yeah, I don't think people really recognize like how notable the Louisville Orchestra has been historically and still is today, to some degree. I think it's just one of those things that people in Louisville often sleep on, excuse me.
And they put out a phenomenal product. Now, as far as more of the substantive stuff that he brought up, like the zoning, again, the fact that he could give more of a national perspective, I think people here either are all in on the type of zoning that we have or completely out and say we need something like Texas and have no zoning regulations. The fact that he can give us kind of an on the ground perspective with that, I think was very critical.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it was really interesting to me in the sense that when I brought up the national reporting, like on Hurricane Harvey and like the impact that zoning had on it, my understanding after reading, articles from mainly like national publications was that zoning played this major role in exacerbating the issues of Harvey. But then you talk to somebody that is a journalist living in the city, kind of like a local perspective for Houston. And that narrative doesn't really match at all what he's seen. That's not his understanding of like what like really the problems were. And that's interesting. I think it also kind of it comports with my understanding of like national reporting in Kentucky too. Like when you see reporting, say on like the Senate primaries or something, there was a lot of focus on that earlier on. And like, I feel like a lot of support went behind, certain candidates when like there was a local sentiment, that might've gone in the opposite direction, or even like the protest movements that are going on. I think national coverage tends to blow up issues that I don't think are necessarily living here in the city. They don't really seem to be as big of an issue as they're made out to be.
So the issues that the locals see as very important and legitimate issues don't get blown up, but the minor kind of, quick clips can be the things that are blown up and put on more of the national circuit.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And honestly, that kind of ties into the paper that I read in getting ready for today's podcast. It was titled Local News and National Politics. And it really was an analysis of the Sinclair Media Group's purchase of Bonton Media a few years ago. It was one of the largest purchases of local news stations in recent memory. And what they tried to do with this paper was see if that massive consolidation of local news stations had any impact on viewership, partisan bias, or the actual coverage, like whether it be local or national in nature. And the findings basically indicate that there was a major shift in the actual reporting that they were doing. The stations that had previously been part of Bonton and then got rolled into Sinclair's like massive portfolio, they went from covering more local news, or a much larger share of their coverage went from local news to national news stories. And the big reason behind that is purely fiscal. You're able to save a ton of money if you can produce one news segment in like a central location and then just distribute it to all of your local affiliates.
Well, it's like why you see the Courier Journal here have a good portion of its paper be USA Today reruns.
Exactly.
Now we still have a great amount of local coverage here in Louisville, so like let's not cut that.
No question.
Sell them short.
But you can see them mirroring each other. If you pull up the USA Today and you pull up the Courier Journal, like they're just going to be it's a carbon copy in certain articles.
Areas,
yeah. And like that saves tremendously on the amount of, you don't have to pay a local reporter to go cover a story or draft their own version of a story. You can just get one person to do it and then share it across all of your affiliates.
Yeah.
And I mean, to a certain degree that makes sense, but you're losing that local coverage that I think is so important. And in fact, you see a very small decrease in viewership after the purchase by Sinclair. It wasn't substantial. I mean, I think the median number of viewers in like the stations they analyzed was about 25,000, and they only lost about 700 viewers on average. And
they had substantial cost saving.
Yeah. And they saved a ton of money exactly on the actual like production of these stories. But from my perspective, when you're talking about like local engagement in politics and you're talking about informing the populace, like you don't want to lose anyone, that's 700 people, like in each of those markets. Like, I think they matter,
Yeah.
but
I especially like you want an informed electorate, you want an informed population, and like you can't really afford to be losing viewers.
Well, and if it was to the point to where they were cutting and making more cookie cutter stories, but they were maybe all of the state of Kentucky was getting similar stories about what was going on in state and local politics. So, whatever city had a big event or thing going on that would get more of the coverage. That would be one thing. But I think what you're talking about is more of a regional and national. Okay, we're going to run more of the national politics stories and less of the state or even local. So like even in the better example that I gave, or more rosy colored example that I gave, you still every city wouldn't get their exact coverage they need, but they still would get a chance at it, or they would still get some sort of coverage versus the more national media, like you're talking about nationalization. It can really take a cut into local journalism. And that's why it's so important to subscribe to your local newspaper too, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, I got a subscription to the Courier. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Like used to read the Herald Leader when I was in Lexington, like super important.
Yeah.
But
so I do think all of that is very important, but I also kind of want to push back on one thing that Michael said, in that I think he and I, if we talked about this more, might come to some sort of agreement. It may have been a little more miscommunication when we talked, but he doesn't see the nonprofit conversion of newspapers as a magic bullet. And I'll agree it's not a magic bullet, but if you really dig down into it, if these newspapers are making money, this saves them so much in tax revenue right now and can allow them more flexibility going into the future. Right. Am I wrong about that?
I don't think there's a question that that's like one tool in the arsenal that you definitely need to consider.
Yeah. You don't want to throw the tool, like you're like going into your tool shed and just throwing out the hammer because you don't need it right now, or you don't think you need it.
I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, like it's definitely like an option that needs to be on the table for, everybody that's facing like a constrained budget right now that isn't already operating as a nonprofit. I think it's like a viable option to save a little bit of money. And, anytime you can do that if you're running a business, it's a good thing.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, is that if you keep it in just the for-profit model, it may start getting closer to the point of seeing what we were just talking about earlier of, maybe the New York Times or a couple other major newspapers become the ones, the USA Today are the ones that just basically get most of the information put out in place of your local newspaper.
Well, I mean, like that's definitely been the trend over the last couple of decades. You've seen a massive consolidation in the media markets. A lot of that might be just like a diversity of outlets, like specifically online. You can get online and find most of the information that like you used to have to go to some type of journalist to get. And
but they may not all have the same standards.
Well, they don't. They almost certainly don't. I mean, you can get online and find something that looks like, a credible news source, and really it's just pumping out conspiracy theories. I think that's another huge issue.
Agreed.
So I can't overstate the value of good journalism.
So in conclusion here a little bit, I guess we saw some interesting conversations on arts, on the zoning regulations, and the kind of newspaper industry as a whole. Is there anything else you think that he kind of hit on that we want to go over? Maybe the segregation issues that he talked about, or like the business development. I thought that was me personally, I thought that was an interesting conversation about how it's so hard to compare Houston and Dallas to Louisville because they are just run so differently, and that Houston and Dallas are just complete economic hubs.
Yeah. I mean, they're massive. They're absolutely massive.
And so I think this is the important aspect of our podcast, is that when we are looking to see what policies we want to pull and kind of apply to Louisville, or see what Louisville could use, we always have to take everything with a grain of salt in the same regard, because these major cities have so many things going for it. It's hard to take a policy in isolation and say, this is working. That's exactly what we should do in Louisville, because there's other factors that could make a particular policy work.
Oh yeah.
You know what I mean? The business development in Houston and Dallas is not solely because of the zoning requirements, right?
Yeah, no question. I mean, like, there's also the issue of like scaling. Whenever you like rescale a policy, like there may be some unintended consequences, like the overall utility of that policy might substantially change.
Mm-hmm. And so I think it's just important as we continue this. I know this is our last episode for our first season, but as we continue our discussions in the future, I think it's important just to recognize we need to try and cherry pick policies as much as we can, but we can't lose the fact that they are in different areas, and they will probably, all these policies will probably need to be tweaked in some regard that we try and find to apply to Louisville.
Yeah, no question.
Absolutely. Well, do you have anything else?
I think that does it for me, man.
All right. Well, it was great talking to you. Thanks for listening, guys.
Yeah, thanks for tuning in. As always, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for joining us on Building This Community. If you'd like any more information, you can follow us on Twitter at BuildingThisCom, COM, or you can follow Andrew
at Andrew J. Klump. And you can also follow Luke
at LMP43. Definitely subscribe, and we look forward to talking to you guys next week.